we're going to talk about podcast hosting. And this is a landscape that's gone through three major changes since podcasting began. And this is great news for you. And it's great news for the lazy podcast, of course. The latest revolution, which I'll get into later, isn't perfectly aligned with a lazy podcast, but we can use it to our advantage. So in the early days of podcasting, when Adam Curry, the podfather, started podcasting and invented the format, you had to host things yourself. Hosting was expensive, streaming was expensive. So if you had a podcast that suddenly got millions of listeners and you're hosting it in your basement on a server, or you're using conventional web hosting where you get charged for bandwidth, you could be very successful and very poor very quickly. So over the years, what's happened is companies have been started to cater to this that don't charge you for bandwidth. And I'm only going to give you two examples of podcast hosting today because there's two main categories really. The podcast hosting I currently use is Podbean, which we can see here. Now, this is part of the second wave of podcast hosting. So when people stopped trying to use hosting that wasn't designed for it and started using tailor-made podcast hosting, companies like Podbean and Libsyn rose up to fill that gap in the market. Now, there is a basics tier. This gives you 5 hours a month. Maybe that's enough for you. And I'd actually, if you're going to go down this avenue, well, this is the second wave of podcast hosting. If you're going to go down this avenue, that may be enough. So just to finish off the overview, second wave of podcast hosting was this. The third wave of podcast hosting is basically Anchor. Now we'll get on to what that is after this. So yeah, this is if you go for something like Libsyn, and there's loads of other options, and they're all fairly good from what I hear. You'll get more or less the same thing. The reason I chose Podbean is because I do the unlimited audio tier for $9 a month. You could record 24 hours, or in theory, maybe they have a fair use policy, but in theory, you could record 24 hours of audio a day and put it all in your unlimited audio plan. You don't want to do that, but at times I've released a lot of content on my podcast, and I don't want to have to be thinking, oh, have I gone over my hours this month? So if there's a chance you might do a lot of content in a month, Podbean's unlimited audio plan is a good option. And this is what I use for all my podcasts to date. The reason for that is this is the third wave, as I call it, podcast hosting, Anchor. Anchor is really is a game changer in a number of ways. It received a lot of criticism because people thought that they owned your content, and they have since denied that. I'm not a lawyer, but I've seen statements in their terms of service that do appear to say they do not own your content. The only other disadvantage I can see with Anchor is that you get less granular information about which podcast apps are viewing your are listening to your podcasts, which may or may not be important to you. It doesn't seem like a huge deal to me. It will tell you how many people are listening, or at least how many hits it's getting from all the different networks. But anyway, what makes Anchor different is if you have a podcast host like Podbean. I've used their iOS app. It's terrible. The website looked like it was designed in 1997 until about 6 months ago. And even now, when you get into the back end, it's very dated. Not to criticize them too much, I've been very happy with Podbean. Overall, they're pretty good. They're doing a good job. I don't have any huge complaints. But Anchor is recently bought by Spotify, which is a bit of a worry because Spotify is trying to take the open nature. And maybe this is actually the biggest red flag with Anchor. They're trying to take the open nature of podcasting. Podcasting is akin to email at the moment. No one really controls it. Although Apple's index has a lot of power, no one really controls podcasting now. It's free, it's open, anyone can do it, and it's more or less nobody can stop you doing it. Anchor and Spotify are trying to take this behind a paywall. They're doing podcasts you can only get if you pay for Spotify, and now they've bought Anchor. Who knows where that will go in future? At some point, they may say, no, you can't listen to any of our content unless you pay for Spotify. This is obviously bad because it takes an open ecosystem and makes it a closed ecosystem. However, if you're just starting a podcast, it probably isn't something you need to worry about. And the Anchor product is amazing. It's so quick, so convenient. some of the things Anchor does for you, its app is really good. And it actually, in some ways, helps us a lot with the Lazy Podcaster process. And we'll get into a video on that shortly. But it also submits you to all of the major podcast indexes automatically without you having to do anything. This is huge. One of the slowest, most cumbersome, awkward things to figure out when you're setting up a podcast, and I have to do this when I set podcasts up on Podbean, is you have to, as well as getting hosting, you need to be in the indexes. The main index is Apple, but Spotify and Google have big indexes as well now. One of the main things you have to do is manually set up accounts and submit your podcast to Apple, Google, and Spotify at minimum. And the problem with that is it's a really awkward process. You have to get all sorts of techie XML tags right. You have to get feed addresses right. You have to put the right figures in all sorts of really esoteric and weird fields. It can take days for you to really figure out how to do it all properly and how to set it up properly. Anchor lets you set up a podcast and publish it literally within 2 minutes. Now, you probably don't want to do that because it's going to suck, a podcast that's that short, but it lets you focus on the content creation. So we're looking at Anchor, and it does seem amazing in many ways, but what are the disadvantages of using this service? And I'd like to say up front that there's obviously a huge number of advantages. It's very quick. It can fit into the Lazy Podcaster system. It's super easy to use. There's a good mobile app, and it's just convenient. It gives you some editing tools, again, that can fit into the Lazy Podcaster system. They can also send you down a rabbit hole. But what are the disadvantages of Anchor? Now we have to look at business really for this. Anchor was started a few years ago and then purchased by Spotify. What is Spotify's motivation? Well, Spotify is what started as a music streaming service. This means they're beholden to the rights holders of the music in terms of how much money they make. If you own the rights to a Rolling Stone album and Spotify's making loads of profits on it, you can say, oh, well, Spotify, now, instead of you getting 50% of the money, how about you just get 10% of the money? Then what does Spotify do? They have to take the Rolling Stones off, which people will get some other way, or they have to accept it. So really, the record companies have just a little volume control. They can just literally decide how much profit Spotify makes. You probably don't want them to go bust because Spotify's main competition are people like Apple and Google who have unlimited cash, don't need to make a profit from music streaming. And when you're trying to compete with companies that don't need to make a profit, when you're entirely reliant on rights holders that you have no control over for your profit as well, this is a very precarious business. If Apple, Google, and especially the record labels were like, meh, we don't like Spotify, let's just close them down, they could press a button and put Spotify out of business immediately. They don't, I think, because the record companies don't want to, even more powerful companies, they don't want powerful companies like Apple and Google having all the power. So it makes sense for them to leave Spotify around now. But if that changed for some reason in the future, they could just put Spotify out of business instantly. So Spotify are trying to diversify. They purchased Gimlet, which is a podcast media studio, for a lot of money recently. And they also purchased Anchor. So what you have to take into account, if you're going to use Anchor, you have to think, why did Spotify buy them? What's their plan? What Spotify need to do is make cash out of podcasting. That's why they're in the business. They need to make cash from somewhere other than music streaming because it's very precarious. So how does Spotify, having an open podcast creation platform that's free, which will be costing them a lot of money to run, how does that make any sense long term? Well, it probably doesn't. Now, this doesn't mean that they're going to either make it paid or make all the content that's created on it go behind a Spotify paywall. Although those are both realistic options that could well happen. But we just don't know what's going to happen. And Anchor is now owned by a company that's desperate to make cash. So you have to take into account the fact that if you start using Anchor now, you may have to change platform in the future. And I would guess, although I don't have any firm information on this, that if the business model of Anchor does change and it either goes behind a Spotify paywall or they start charging money, I'd say one of those two is, again, this is a guess. I have no inside information, but one of those two is quite likely, I think. Because Spotify is a profit-making entity. It needs to make money, and Anchor is costing them money as it stands at the moment. So you have to be prepared for that disruption that's, I would say, likely to happen within the next few years. Now, you probably will be able to move to another platform, and it probably won't be a big deal. But just take that into account. You need to take these things into account. There's been a lot of free podcast platforms in the past. Every single one that I'm aware of has gone bust because they hemorrhage money and they don't make money. Who knew? I guess they thought they'd make cash out of advertising or something somehow. I mean, this may be another way that Anchor will make cash, just taking a cut of your ads. But again, if you're a small podcast, you're not going to be making much money from ads. If anything, if you're a big podcast, you're making a lot of money from ads and they want to take a cut, you'll just move off the platform. So again, I don't think that business model makes sense either. So Anchor may seem too good to be true, and in the long term, it might be too good to be true. But if you just want to get something up quickly as a test, it could be a good option. There are ways that it slows down the lazy podcaster process, and there are ways that it makes it a lot easier.